Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Amy Jo Levine. Professor Levine holds the Bachelor of Arts from Smith College and the Master of Arts and PhD from Duke University. She has honorary doctorates from the University of Richmond, the Episcopal Theological Seminary of the Southwest, the University of South Carolina Upstate, Drury University, Christian Theological Seminary, and Franklin College. A self-described Yankee Jewish feminist, Professor Levine is a member of the congregation Sharif Israel, an Orthodox synagogue in Nashville, although she is quite often unorthodox. Professor Levine has held grants from the Mellon Foundation, NEH, and ACLS, and she has held office in the Society of Biblical Literature, Catholic Biblical Association, and Association for Jewish Studies. She served as Alexander Robertson Fellow, University of Glasgow, and the Catholic Biblical Association Scholar to the Philippines. In spring 2019, she was the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. Formerly, Professor Amy Jo Levine is a former University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, and Mary Jane Werven, Professor of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity and ANS. She is also affiliated professor at the Wolf Institute Center for Jewish-Christian Relations, Cambridge. But currently, she is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. So welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Amy Jo Levine.
Happy to be with you.
So I would like to start us off with, what kind of person do you think Jesus was?
What kind of person was he?
Mhm.
I think he's a first century Galilean Jew who anticipates the end of the world is coming during his lifetime, and he has some hand in that. And he's in the process of attempting to prepare his people for the inbreaking of what he calls the kingdom of God, or what Jewish tradition refers to as the Olam Haba, the world to come.
And do you think Jesus' earliest followers thought that he was the Messiah?
It wouldn't surprise me. There were other messianic candidates at the time. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about at least two messiahs. There are various job descriptions of the Messiah, whether shepherd or priest or royal Messiah in the image of King David, or somebody like Elijah or Enoch, prophets of the past who were existing in heaven in bodily form. Some people thought John the Baptist was the Messiah. So did he think he was? Yeah, in the sense that Messiah means God's anointed, somebody appointed to do a specific task, which has monumental concerns. So did he think so? Probably. Did his disciples think so? Probably. Did the followers of John the Baptist think that John the Baptist was the Messiah? Most likely.
What kind of messianic expectation were they expecting? Can you tell us what that is?
Well, to ask what Jews are expecting depends upon the Jew that you ask. I mean, there's no sense of like, here's what all the Jews thought. There's no like Jew think. And there's no head Jew to tell us what to think. And if there were, we probably wouldn't listen anyway. Jews are not just a faith community. We're not just a religion. We are a people. We're an ethnic group, kind of like Americans are a people. And just as Americans disagree on, pretty much everything, most Jews in antiquity had various views of what God wanted them to do and how best to understand Torah. And so they had different views of understanding the Messiah. What many of them thought, and I suspect the majority, is that the Messiah would come with the Messianic age. So the job of the Messiah is to bring about the Messianic age. And what's that? The Messianic age is the time when everybody comes back from the dead, not just one person. And following that, there's a final judgment that when the Messiah comes, all the Gentiles will stream to Zion to worship the God of Israel, not by converting to Judaism, but to turn from their own gods to the one God whom the Jews and the Samaritans proclaim. There would be peace on earth. Swords would be turned into plowshares, and little kids would not cry at night because they were hungry or they were scared or they were in pain. So they're expecting a change in the world that everybody could see when God was finally reigning and not Rome or whatever human authority was in charge.
And which one of those two messiahs do you think that the followers of Jesus thought that he was?
Well, I've just given you half a dozen different messiahs, so I can't answer the question which of the two. Did his followers expect him to bring about the Messianic age when the dead would rise and there would be a final judgment? Absolutely. The earliest New Testament documents we have are probably the letters of Paul. And Paul, if we look at those earlier letters like First Thessalonians, expects that the dead who were followers of Jesus will rise first, and then those who are alive will rise to meet the Christ in the air and greet him when he returns. Paul anticipates that Jesus will come back and bring about that general resurrection of the dead, which is why in his first epistle to the Corinthians, his first letters to the Jesus followers in Corinth, he talks about Jesus as first fruits of the resurrection. First fruits means final harvest, same season. So the problem was that the earliest followers of Jesus expected him to come back relatively swiftly, and that didn't happen. So what we find in later texts is a sense of regrouping, with Luke giving us an idea of Jesus ascending into heaven, so we have to wait, or John talking about another paraclete, another comforter or defense attorney coming to take the place of Jesus. And when we get to the later documents in the New Testament, like Second Peter, for example, they're making excuses like, well, a day for God is like 1,000 years, so don't worry about it. Be assured that he will come back, but stop worrying about the when.
Can you tell us specifically about those that were expecting the warrior Messiah? What kind of Messiah is that? Like, who is the warrior Messiah?
Yeah, well, I hear a lot from my Christian students about how all Jews are anticipating a warrior Messiah, and they rejected Jesus because he taught about peace, and that's wrong 9 ways to Sunday. First of all, as I've already mentioned, there is no simple messianic template. When we do have images of a military type Messiah, as we do, for example, in a group of texts called the Psalms of Solomon, written about the year 63 before Jesus, when Rome comes into the land of Israel and basically takes over. There's in Psalm 17, there's a sense of this warrior Messiah, but he slays by the word of his mouth. In other words, he speaks, and people fall into line. He doesn't engage in a bloodshed. The best example of a warrior Messiah we have is actually from the New Testament, from the book of Revelation, the rider on the white horse. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, from 132 to 135, we have a figure who comes into history known as Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star. His real name was Simon Bar Kokhba, and he actually starts engaging in a war against Rome, and for a while it looks like he was going to win. Rabbi Akiva, very famous rabbi, put to death by the Romans about a century after Jesus, proclaimed Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah because he's winning this war against Rome, which nobody thought could happen. At which point, according to ancient Jewish sources, another rabbi says to him, Akiva, grass will grow in your cheeks before the Messiah comes, which is Aramaic for you'll be pushing up daisies. So we do have Bar Kokhba as an example of a militaristic Messiah, but most of the sources don't speak to militaristic messiahs. They speak to God entering into history and straightening out the muck that we have made of life on earth. As far as Jesus goes, his followers are armed. In the Gospel of Luke, he advises his followers, if you don't have a sword, go sell your cloak and buy one, at which point the guys go, we got a couple right here. We know they're armed because somebody gets an ear chopped off in Gethsemane at Jesus' arrest. By the time we get up to John, we know who wielded the sword and what the name of the person was who lost the ear, which Jesus then fixes. So it's not as if Jesus is all about peace per se, but he, like other so-called messianic figures, is not interested in starting a war. Most Jewish messianic figures were not. They didn't need to, because God would come with God's angels to engage in this final battle. So they're not looking for a militaristic general. They're looking for the one God appointed to lead the people somehow into this messianic age. And for some Jews, there was a great concern for the messianic age, but there wasn't a Messiah, because the important thing was the messianic age, not the individual who facilitated it.
Since you mentioned that the followers of Jesus were armed, what do you make of the Zealot hypothesis in light of that?
Oh, yeah. So there was a very good author who was not a biblical scholar who wrote a book called Zealot a number of years ago. It was a very well-written book, which was based on what the New Testament doesn't tell us. So here we have the New Testament, which does not suggest that Jesus was a zealot. And the thesis then goes, well, all that political, militaristic stuff must have been written out by the tradition. And the historian in me, recognizing that all sources are tendentious, and the people who are telling the story of Jesus have to tell it in a particular way for their own needs. But I'm very hesitant to base a thesis on what's not there. That strikes me as moving more to the realm of fantasy. I don't think Jesus was a zealot. The zealots that we have, at least described by Josephus, really start showing up in the 60s, and Jesus dies in the 30s of the first century. So I don't see him as engaging in any sort of militaristic group. And in fact, I don't see him as particularly concerned with Rome per se. Most of his activity, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, takes place in the Galilee. And the Galilee is not under direct Roman occupation. There are no Roman soldiers stationed in the Galilee. Galilee is ruled by a Jewish client king named Herod Antipas. When he comes into Jerusalem, I'm not seeing a whole lot of anti-Roman activity, and nor need he have engaged in such. Why? Because if one thinks that God is about to bring about God's reign, the kingdom of God, the end of the world as we know it, then there's no reason to fight Rome any more reason than there is to fight Herod Antipas or the rich person next door. I don't think that's his agenda. And I think to look at Jesus as this anti-imperial, anti-Roman zealot misconstrues the historical setting. I think it misconstrues the gospel setting. And I think it gets Jesus very wrong. But does it work in the contemporary pulpit if you don't like the government? You bet. So it preaches well. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's good history.
I would like to return to Revelation just for a second, because earlier you mentioned that Revelation, the way it portrays the Messiah, is more like the warrior Messiah type. When you look at Revelation and you compare and contrast it with the other books of the New Testament, like the Gospels or other texts that may talk about that talks about the second coming of Jesus, do you think that these various different books are being influenced by these different or differing messianic expectations in the first century?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, whereas on the one hand, Revelation gives us an image of this rider on a horse where, the blood is up to the horse's bridle. It's that thick. Revelation also gives us the image of the Christ as a slain lamb. So Revelation is not restricted to one single image of Jesus, nor would apocalyptic literature, of which Revelation actually gives its name to the genre, do so. To me, I think the better question is not, are they participating in different images of who the Messiah was? I think they're participating in different images of what they think God's justice is, and what they think of the temporal calendar, and when is the realm of God going to enter into human history. So they're participating in a broader cultural concern that we can find through other Jewish texts of the time, which fit into that general category that scholars call apocalyptic, where how do you deal with the mess that the world is? And they have various constructions of it, some of which concern a messianic age, some of which concern tours of heaven or tours of hell. We might think of the later version of that, which would be Dante's Inferno or the Paradiso or the Purgatorio. And some of them are actually participating in some Roman or Egyptian models of what redemption looks like. So what we have is this wonderful cultural mix in the first century. It's not as if first century Jews lived in a vacuum. I mean, they had experiences in Babylon. They had experiences in Persia under Greek rule, now under Roman rule. And they're necessarily picking up some aspects of those culture as well, plus developing what they have from their own scriptures.
So I have this question, and specifically about the title of the book. Why refer to Jesus as the misunderstood Jew?
Yeah, well, we had to put in a subtitle called The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, because people were afraid it
Right.
was autobiographical. Oh, she's writing about herself, right? So I did not come up with the title. The press, Harper One, came up with the title, and Harper's very good at coming up with titles. And I think they were spot on. So often when we read books about Jesus, we get Jesus was a Jew, but like Jesus was a marginal Jew, or Jesus was a peculiar Jew, or Jesus was a revelatory Jew. And what I wanted to talk about was how Jesus' own Judaism, his Jewish practice and his belief, as well as the broader Jewish context in which he lived, gets misunderstood by well-meaning priests and pastors and Sunday school teachers and Bible study leaders as some sort of toxic cesspool. And then Jesus comes in and invents things like feminism, social justice, and healthcare. So it seems to me that if we get Jesus' Jewish context wrong, we're going to get him wrong. And misunderstanding that context gets us misunderstanding Jesus. And that's how the good people at Harper eventually got to the title. And I think they were right. If we misunderstand Jesus' Jewish context, we will misunderstand Jesus, and worse. If we misunderstand that context, typically what happens is the context becomes the negative foil over against Jesus is placed, rather than the life, the setting, and the people where he lived and with whom he lived.
That's an interesting point that you made there, because it largely has to do with people, if this is the right phrase, trying to modernize Jesus, or trying to place their modern views into Jesus. And so the present, they're not, in other words, they're not distinguishing properly between the historical context that Jesus is lived in, from the modern context that we're in today, the present.
I think what you've just described is an affect of the problem, but I think the problem goes deeper. People today should read the New Testament, any biblical text, any sacred scripture, from their own social location or their own subject position. Because if they don't, then the text no longer has meaning. It's just an historical artifact. And people in churches are not looking just at an historical artifact, say the writings of Aristotle, for example, or Homer. That text has to mean something to them today. So therefore, it's appropriate to bring a modern lens to understand the biblical to understand what the Bible might be saying to the contemporary Christian or the contemporary church. The problem is when that first century Jewish context is then cast in whatever we don't like about contemporary society. The first century Jewish context then becomes like this utilitarian thing. This is particularly effective, by the way, for liberal Christians for whom virgin birth or walking on water or raising the dead or dying and coming back after 3 days seem more like fairy tales than fact, because their minds don't go to the supernatural or the mysterious. So how then do you make Jesus relevant? Well, the easiest way then to make him relevant, if you still want to hang out in a church, is to make him the only Jew who cared about social justice. So there are clear reasons why people go in this direction, but they're not good reasons. And what they wind up doing then is either introducing or reinforcing anti-Semitic stereotypes, and that's not good for anybody.
And when it comes to the Gospels, how reliable compared to to how unreliable they are when it comes to trying to figure out what can we know about Jesus, and distinguishing what we know about Jesus from the embellishment, exaggerations that the gospel writers uh, provide.
Oh my gosh. Well, there's no way I can answer that, because you seem to be asking for a percentage, 33%, 72%.
Mm.
I can't do that. I think they're reliable in certain cases. Like, I think there was a first century Jew named Jesus, who was from the Galilee, who was known as a healer and an exorcist, who gathered a group of disciples, who went to Jerusalem, and who died on a cross. And I also think that his followers believed that they saw him rise from the dead, and that changed their lives. Did he say absolutely everything the New Testament says he says? Well, Jesus spoke Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Greek. And we have multiple Greek manuscripts that don't always say the same thing. So can we get a general sense of, well, that sounds like Jesus? Yeah, I think so. Can we get a sense of he said absolutely this? Don't think so. And we can go through the Gospels. Most New Testament scholars think Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke used Mark. So we can look at changes that Matthew makes to Mark and say, oh, well, this looks like something that's part of Matthew's agenda, because these changes are consistent all the way through in different parts of stories and different genres of stories. So maybe we don't have Jesus here. Maybe we have Matthew attributing to Jesus something that Jesus would say. Even determining how accurate the Gospels are becomes a problem when we think of contemporary biographies. There are numerous biographies of people who live much closer in time than us, whether John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln and so on. And they disagree, which is why we keep getting biographies about them. So if we can't agree on who these folks are, even if we have much better records or even if we have TV tapes of them, it's very hard to go back to the first century other than to say, yeah, it sounds like something Jesus would have said. And that's not exact, but it's probably the best that we can do.
Yeah, I think my question came out wrong because what I really meant to ask is what kind of historical criteria, in other words, methodology, does a historian employ in determining what is most probable, what's most likely to have occurred regarding the historical Jesus from that which didn't?
Yes, well, we have no clear-cut criteria. If we did, we wouldn't be writing books about Jesus incessantly. And we have no agreement on any of this. So it used to be back in the good old days when Noah was still on the ark and I was in graduate school, that we had something called the criteria of authenticity. So we would say, well, if you have Jesus saying something or doing something in two or more independent sources, then it's more likely he said it and did it. However, we don't think we've got independent sources. So if Matthew and Luke used Mark and John used all three synoptic gospels, I have no independent sources. And if they had access to Paul, who's writing before any of the gospel writers, I still don't have any independent sources. So that criterion of multiple attestation goes out the window. Or we would say, well, if we have something that Jesus says that's dissimilar from first century Judaism and dissimilar from what the church would say, in other words, if it's weird, it must go back to Jesus. Well, that's not a logical criterion either, because we don't have enough information about what first century Jews thought across the board or what the church thought across the board to determine what was weird or not. And moreover, if the gospel writers put it into the text, they didn't think it was weird. Well, those were our two best criteria. Neither one of those works. And then we say, well, if we conclude that something is authentic in Mark and we find something similar in John, then it's probably authentic. But that's a matter of taste. And it's also a matter of, does one source know the other? Today we use memory theory, psychobiology, studies of shamanism, studies of composition criticism, comparison to other literature of the time, whether fables from the Roman sources to look at parables or apocalyptic literature, to look at texts like Mark 13, which is this little apocalypse in the middle of the gospel. I mean, we can do all that, but that doesn't mean it goes back to Jesus. It just means it's in the water. So did Jesus say this or did one of his followers say this? The best we can do is make the best argument we can with the burden of proof relying on the person who's making the argument. And if somebody else comes in and says, well, have you considered this? Then our job as scholars is to say, all right, let me consider that and see if I've changed my mind and why. So the upshot is, we don't know.
Are the Gospels dependent or independent of Paul's letters?
I think they know something of Paul's letters. It would surprise me very much if they did not, but they're not doing what Paul was doing. So they're writing for different purposes. Paul is writing to explain to Gentile followers of Jesus what they're supposed to do as they wait for Jesus to return. He's not telling stories about Jesus for the most part. I mean, he talks about the risen Christ and the importance of Jesus' death and resurrection, but very rarely quotes Jesus directly. He quotes Jesus on divorce. Jesus says, don't get divorced. I think Jesus probably said, don't get divorced. That strikes me as historically viable. And Mark seems to be backing that up. So did they know Paul? I think so. Reading Matthew in light of Paul gives me why is Matthew so strong on the law, on Torah? Well, because Paul can give the impression, depending upon how you read Paul, that Torah might not be that important. And Matthew was saying, oh, no, it really is very important. But the upshot is even there we don't know. More, even if we did know, it doesn't mean that the gospel writers got Paul right. In the same way that the Gospels can be read in multiple ways, and you can draw multiple conclusions about Jesus from them, so we can read Paul in multiple ways. I think what's happening in New Testament studies right now is we're seeing something called the Paul within Judaism movement, which takes very seriously the idea that Paul is writing to Gentiles and he is the apostle to the Gentiles. So when Paul talks about things like the impossibility of following the law, well, for a Gentile, that would be the case. Gentile men who were joining these assemblies gathered in Jesus' name cannot be circumcised on the eighth day. It's a little too late. And as Paul says, these laws were not written for you. These laws were designed to keep Israel distinct among the nations. So once we get, and this goes back to the sense about getting Jesus in the right context, we have to understand who Paul is and to whom he is writing in order better to understand Paul.
And in regards to Paul's letters, what do you make of Acts? Does Acts know Paul's letters or not? 'Cause I know that there are different scholars that some say yes, some say no.
Oh, I think so. And I think what Acts is trying to do is with Paul is pretty much what Luke is trying, because Luke and Acts are written by the same person. I think what Acts is trying to do with Paul is the same thing that the Gospel of Luke is trying to do with Jesus, which is to spin. And I don't mean spin in a negative way, but Luke has a particular sense of who Jesus was and how people should follow Jesus. And similarly, Luke has a particular sense of what the early church was like and what Paul was like, and is trying to control that reputation as well. Luke actually tells us that in the beginning of the Gospel. Luke says, other people have attempted to put the story together, but I'm going to do it accurately and in order. Which means if Luke has a copy of Mark, which I think is likely, and if Luke has a copy of Matthew, which I'm increasingly thinking is likely, then Luke is looking at these other Gospels and going, yeah, this isn't bad, but I'm going to do it in a better way, a more organized way, a way that's going to highlight certain themes that I, Luke, think to be important that might not shine as brightly in Mark or shine as brightly in Matthew. I think Acts is doing the same thing with Paul. So if you read Paul and you come to the conclusion that Paul don't like Torah, and then you read Acts, Paul is like a super Pharisee. I can picture him with a giant letter P on his chest going, super Pharisee, where he worships in synagogues and he offers sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple and never gives up his Pharisaic identity. I think this is spin control. It doesn't mean it's historically inaccurate. It might actually be true. But I think Luke is also trying to tell the story in a particular way. And I find relatively convincing arguments that would put Acts maybe as late as early 2nd century. So Paul's letters are clearly out there. And we know that Paul is being misunderstood. I mean, the Petrine epistles say there's stuff in Paul that's hard to understand. Well, if the New Testament itself admits that, good, because there is. And then we have Luke giving us one version of Paul. I think we get another version of Paul in the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, written in Paul's name, but under changed circumstances.
Does Markan priority help us understand the historical Jesus? I know in some way we kind of covered that earlier, but I wanted to ask that question specifically. So I would like you to expand on that.
It's a good question. And the problem is that the answer is more complicated than it should be. So it had been, if we look back to biblical scholarship in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, when the idea of Markan priority really begins, that people thought, oh, well, Matthew and Luke might be dependent on Mark, but Mark is earlier and therefore Mark is more historically accurate. Well, that doesn't work either, because earlier sources are not necessarily more historically accurate, any more than a first draft of a paper is better than the final product. Matthew and Luke may have had access to sources that Mark did not have. And plus, Mark, like the other gospel writers, is not just recording tradition. Mark is a creative author who is putting together the story of Jesus as Mark thinks it should be told. So Mark is no more objective than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark may be missing material, which is really important. Like, the Our Father prayer, which I think goes back to Jesus. And Mark is just as tendentious as everybody else. So what Mark can do is help us, if we look at Matthew and Luke as editing Mark, to see where the changes are being made. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that we know more about the historical Jesus. It tells us we know more about the gospel writers.
And in light of that, what do you make of the Q document? You mentioned earlier that you have become increasingly leaning towards the idea that Luke knew Matthew.
I know I've become a Q skeptic, and I feel very disloyal to my graduate student teachers. When I first started working in biblical studies, I actually wrote a number of articles about Q and indeed the Q community. And the more I thought about it, the more weird that sounded. I'm now creating a hypothetical community based on a hypothetical document, which is a wonderful exercise in intellectual imagination, but it might have nothing to do with history. So a couple of years ago, with my friend Ben Witherington III, who is a Methodist biblical scholar, we wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, which meant we had to go through Luke verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And as I'm doing this, I became more and more convinced that Luke actually knew both Mark and Matthew. It's an easier solution because otherwise you have to invent the hypothetical document. I find the work of Mark Goodacre, who teaches at Duke, who began this whole thing about really put into high gear. He didn't begin it, but put into high gear the idea of Q skepticism. And many of his arguments caused me to rethink, what I thought I knew, I may not know. So yes, I have become a Q skeptic.
And what do you make of the reverse position that Matthew knew Luke?
I've seen it argued, but I don't find it convincing. It makes more sense to me that Luke knew Matthew.
With that being said, you mentioned earlier that Jesus spoke Aramaic. Do you think that Matthew, assuming Luke knew Matthew, that Matthew and potentially Luke had access to oral tradition that may explain how they got certain material that does not appear in Mark? What do you make of that?
Well, it's easier to say that Luke had a copy of Matthew, and then you don't have to posit something that comes earlier. All New Testament scholars, to some extent or another, talk about the oral tradition. Here's the problem. It's oral, which means we don't have it. So anytime we start talking about the oral tradition, we are inventing, we are hypothesizing, we got nothing. At least if we're looking at a copy of Mark, whether it's some sort of original or not, who knows, or even if there was an original Mark. At least we've got a text we can work on so that we can do this comparison. Oral tradition is very, very fuzzy. So was it there? Sure. How do you get purchase on it? I don't know.
So another question I have related to that is, do you think Matthew simply invented the double tradition then, just created all that material? Or do you think he may have been, whoever wrote Matthew, was an early follower of Jesus and could have heard about certain things he said in his lifetime?
Sure. All the evangelists are followers of Jesus. So that's a given because they tell us that they are.
Right.
They don't self-identify, but they're proclaiming the gospel of Jesus, who they look at as Lord and Messiah. So they're clearly in the system. I think Matthew had access to other written documents. That would not surprise me. There would have been some floating around. Did Matthew receive stuff from oral tradition? Did Matthew know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew Peter? Sure, quite possible. Luke tells us at the beginning that there are eyewitnesses and servants of the word with whom he has consulted. So Luke may have known somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. But even if we go history in that direction, memory is extremely malleable. And people's memories of what they heard over time change, just as when people tell stories about what they did when they were in college or what they did when they were children, those stories are honed through years of telling the story to figure out what words you use and what's the most effective way of presenting this. There are so many couples who, one spouse will say, remember when this happened? And the other spouse will say, well, that's not when it was, and that's not where it was, and that's not what I said. And both members of this pair were in the same place at the same time, and they lived together. So it shows us how difficult it is just to rely on memory. But could Matthew have heard stories and then recorded those stories? Absolutely. So if we look, for example, at parables follow particular structural outlines. Kind of like, to use cross-cultural analysis, fairy tales or folk tales. So you have something called in fairy tale or folklore analysis, the rule of three. You have two pigs that aren't good with construction and one who can build a decent house, or two ugly stepsisters and Cinderella. So when you look at parables, you sometimes you find the same rule of three. A priest and a Levite screw up, and a Samaritan, totally unexpected, winds up doing the right thing. Or two people take their talents and make more money with it, and somebody else buries it. These are very, very easy to remember because they follow a certain structural outline. But would the words that are imposed on that structure change? Of course they would. Just as the story of Cinderella changes when you go from the French version to the Brothers Grimm version to the Chinese version. It's all the same story, but the details change. So how do you get back to the historical Jesus? You can't. Moreover, Jesus as a storyteller likely told the same story on multiple occasions and sometimes told it differently, in the same way that today singers or comedians, depending upon where they're doing their performance, will change the act slightly to adapt to the needs of the contemporary audience to whom they are speaking. Right? No performances are exactly the same.
What do you make of Paul's view of Jesus?
Paul thought that Jesus was a first century Jew who died on a cross, and in his Jesus's extraordinary fidelity to the will of God, such that he was willing to die, he sets the model for his followers and offers a reset, because through his fidelity, he's able to bring not only uh, Jews, but also Gentiles into the sense of being part of the family of Abraham. Jews were already there, Gentiles were not, and to give them a place in this Messianic age. In Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, Paul repeats something that's usually called the Christ hymn, although whether it's actually a hymn or not is a big question. But it seems like some sort of creedal statement where he identifies Jesus as in the form of God. The Greek term here is morphe, like metamorphosis or morphing. And then he gives up this divinity, empties himself out, takes on the form not only of a human being, but of an enslaved human being, dies on the cross, and then returns to heaven. So this idea of a heavenly being who descends to earth and then reascends to heaven, well, that's the story of wisdom when we look at Proverbs 9 or the wisdom of Solomon. It's a sense of the Holy Spirit descending and ascending, and it fits very nicely within a first century Jewish context. So Paul sees Jesus both as a divine figure who takes on human form and a human figure who displays the epitome of fidelity. And because of his fidelity, this faith of Christ, in other words, the Christ's own faith, he opens the door to Gentile salvation.
When Paul refers to the wrath, which event do you think he was referring to
Oh,
specifically?
you mean about the wrath to come?
Yeah.
Um, well, it's hard to tell. On the one hand, Paul may be talking about the inbreaking of God's rule, and the inbreaking of God's rule requires a final judgment. Well, if there's a final judgment, generally in antiquity, it wasn't like, oh, everybody gets into the sheep line, right? Everybody gets saved. I'm referring to Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats here in chapter 25 of Matthew. So if God is going to come in and reward righteousness and punish sin, there's a whole lot of wrath that's going to be involved in that. So the idea is, how do you prepare yourself for this inbreaking of what the ancient prophets of Israel, like the prophet Joel or the prophet Amos, would call the day of the Lord? That's a pretty wrathful moment unless you're in God's good graces. And it's a really good prompt to say, well, even if you've been screwing up to now might be a good time to like change your process and get with the program. So I think it is probably that. I don't think it's like Rome's going to come in and wipe you out. That doesn't strike me as likely for Paul.
Why do you think that Paul, for some reason, doesn't refer to Pilate, assuming that he did not write the pastoral epistles? Why do you think he avoided mentioning Pilate? Because in 1st, 2nd Corinthians, we get some vague rulers, archons. He won't specify who they are. Had Jesus executed, or the Jews are the ones that are at fault in 1 Thessalonians. So why do you think that he won't mention Pilate? What do you
Yeah.
think the deal with that is?
Well, you've just asked a multi-pronged question. So if we look at 1 Thessalonians 2, 14b to 16, I think it is, where Paul talks about the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus and all that. Well, the reason Paul's doing that is because he's analogizing the situation of the Thessalonians who were being most likely ridiculed, if not directly persecuted, by local pagans, local Gentiles, for their belief in Jesus. And he's saying, you know what, the people in Judea and Jesus himself put up from the same thing with people who are part of their own group. So there's no reason to mention Pilate, because Pilate's not part of that own group. And it's likely that these people in Thessalonica, like the folks in Corinth or the folks in Philippi or the folks in Rome, were actually experiencing some difficulty from the locals. Why? Because these followers of Jesus are no longer worshiping local gods or state gods or imperial gods. So if you don't worship the state god or the city god, then the gods will turn on you and betray you. So these followers of Jesus, these Gentile followers of Jesus, not worshiping their own family or state gods, would be looked at as betraying family and state. And that's not going to put you in a comfortable position vis-a-vis your neighbors. When it comes to the archons that Paul is talking about, and his references things like to principalities and powers, those are not, I think, contemporary political appointees. I think these are heavenly beings, because the world at the time was highly populated with supernatural beings, and some of them weren't nice. So we might think of nice ones, those would be angels, and we might think of more malevolent ones, which would be principalities and powers and the minions of Satan. So what we tend to forget when thinking about anybody living in antiquity is that the world is not just God up there and us down here. There's all these layers of people who are a little bit more divine than others, and divine beings who are a little less godly than others. And you have to deal with all of those divine beings. So principalities and powers and archons seems to fit there. So Paul's got to deal with problems on a variety of fronts. He's got to deal with local governments. And he's got to deal with the Jewish community that, for the most part, has not accepted his proclamation. The Messianic age has begun, because they haven't seen any sign of it. He's got to deal with Gentiles who have joined his assemblies, who are trying to figure out what it means to follow this Jesus fellow, particularly if it doesn't mean circumcision, Sabbath, dietary regulations. So how do you do this? And he's got to deal with his own desire to tell Gentiles to stop worshiping local gods, even though that's going to get him arrested and probably eventually killed.
How should one define anti-Judaism?
Oh my gosh. People have been debating that in the scholarly world. People are debating that in politics today with various definitions of what constitutes anti-Semitism. Part of it is kind of like saying, how do you define racism? Or how do you define pornography? Or how do you define bigotry? I mean, for me, if something looks like it's reinforcing or inculcating Jew hatred, I think, yeah, that's pretty close. Any word that we use is already going to be compromised, and that's the problem with our own language. So it had been in the past that when we talked about the New Testament, we would talk about anti-Judaism and leave the question of anti-Semitism, which is only coined in the 19th century anyway, to be a racist sort of thing. Because in the New Testament, if you're a Jew, but you go on to Team Jesus, then you're fine, right? By the time you get up to the Spanish Inquisition, so now we're looking at the 15th century, if you're a Jew and you convert to Catholicism, there's still a little bit of a problem with you. It's a question of, you had this kind of bad blood, as it was called in Spanish. And then you have, good old anti-Semitism, good old racist anti-Semitism coming in with Willem Marr and his buddies in the late 19th century, epitomized by what happened in under Nazi concerns in the middle of the 20th century. But how do you make these distinctions? It's very, very hard to do. And what looks like anti-Semitism to one person doesn't look like anti-Semitism to another. So even if we look at contemporary politics, which I do not want to get into for a variety of reasons, that's not my expertise, and somebody criticizes the state of Israel for bombing people in Gaza, is that anti-Semitism? Or is that philo-Semitism, because you're saying to Israel, you have certain values and bombing entire families might not be one of them? So how do you know? It's very, very hard. What I try to do in my writings and in my teaching is to help people listen more closely with somebody else's ears. So rather than come down with some sort of hard and fast definition of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, because I can't do that, is to say, here's how this text sounds to me. Maybe you might want to rephrase. Or here's how this text sounds to me. Maybe when you're preaching on this text, you might want to add in a couple of other lines about let's not go in an anti-Jewish direction or an anti-Semitic direction. Right. One other way of looking at this, there are multiple ways, but this may be a good example, is that a number of New Testament scholars presume that the Gospels in Paul cannot be anti-Jewish because the Gospel writers in Paul are themselves Jews, right? So therefore, it's just all in-house. It can't be anti-Jewish. That's nonsense. Jews can be anti-Jewish just as people in minoritized communities can be anti-other members of their own minoritized communities, or Americans can be anti-American. So I find most of the arguments that have been used to exculpate, to proclaim innocent, the New Testament of anti-Judaism to be more apologetic than they are, at least to me, convincing.
What do you make of the attempt of distinguishing the Jewish God from the Christian God?
I think it's generally unhelpful. Theologically speaking, the Jews and Christians both worship the God who created the heaven and the earth. The God to whom Jesus tells his followers to pray with the language of our Father, that's Matthew, or just Father, that's Luke, is the same God to whom Jews prayed and whom Jews addressed as Father. But we have different understandings of this God. So that in most of Christianity, God is triune, it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and in Judaism, God is one. On the other hand, if you were to say to Christians, are you monotheist? Do you believe in one God? The answer is yes, we just believe in one God, but manifested in three persons. Persons, probably not the best translation, but that's how it typically comes out. So we understand God through different lenses. But is it the same God? At least from the biblical tradition, absolutely. God does not get some sort of personality transplant around the time of the deuterocanonical literature, like the Old Testament Apocrypha. And Jesus is not proclaiming a new and different God, like a new and improved God. So even when Christians will sometimes make the claim about the Old Testament God of wrath and the New Testament God of love, which is nonsense, I just say, fine, the Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul, which is Psalm 23. And you are condemned to the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, which is Jesus. So we have this God that cannot be put in a box, and that is all merciful and also inclined to get a little miffed at human sin. And that once we think we fully understand this God, we go back to the sources and we find out, in fact, we don't. Where we will disagree, Jews and Christians, unless you're a Messianic Jew, is on whether Jesus, in a particular way, participates in the Godhead more than any other human being would be a child of God, or the role of the Holy Spirit, which is not super strong, at least in Second Temple Judaism. So we disagree on vocabulary, we disagree on images, but I think the basics are the same. It's the one God who created heaven and earth.
And does it seem like that the idea that the Jewish God and the Christian God are different from one another, does that idea begin with Marcion, or is there evidence of it happening before Marcion?
Well, Marcion, who pretty much took half of the Christian community with him in his view that the Old Testament God was a stupid and inept God, a demiurge. He's writing sometime, and we don't have his stuff directly. We've got people talking about what he said. He's writing in like the 140s or so. What came before him? Well, we don't have that much. We've got the New Testament, and the New Testament seems pretty clear that the God of ancient Israel is the God of Jesus. That doesn't seem to be a problem. They don't have an Old Testament yet. The term hasn't been invented. So does it come in before Marcion? It's possible. But how would we know? That we don't have sources doesn't mean they didn't exist. Absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. But I don't think Marcion is coming out of a Jewish environment. Other so-called Gnostic writers seem to make that distinction between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And I can see why some might, particularly if they don't understand Jewish interpretation of our own scriptures.
And what do you think causes people to stereotype Judaism?
Same thing that causes people to stereotype Christianity. Because we don't know our neighbors, because it's easier to stereotype than to take the time to learn. Because if we're in a preaching moment, it's easier to look at all, people on our team is better than people on the other team. And then we do everything we can to make that other team look negative. Just look at what football fans do. Um, uh, so it's a combination of ignorance and self-definition. So we define ourselves over against the other. The closer the other is to us, the more we have to define over against. Christians and Buddhists don't have that much to fuss about, but Baptists and Methodists, oh yeah, you have to make that distinction. Or Missouri Synod Lutherans and Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. The closer you are, the more rancorous those forms of self-definition will be. Jews and Christians are fighting over the same legacy. Who is the appropriate heir of the book of Genesis or the Psalms or the prophet Isaiah? Do Gentiles fully take over all the promises given to Israel? That would be called replacement theology, which is popular in some churches. Or do Jews still have a part of the covenant, which is popular in other churches? Should Jews look at Christians as just a bunch of polytheistic yahoos? Or look at Christians as the Gentile version of those who would worship the God of Israel, and that becomes a good thing. So it's easier to stereotype than to learn. It's easier to be a bigot than it is to be gracious. It's easier to be condemnatory than it is to say, gee, I might be wrong on this, or this other person might actually have a pretty good idea. So stereotyping is a combination of ignorance and laziness and self-definition.
And in my closing questions, what do you make of external sources regarding Jesus? Josephus mentioning Jesus, Tacitus as well. What do you make of what they say about Jesus? And in my second part to the question, what do you make of the reference that Josephus makes regarding the death of James, the brother of Jesus?
So let's start with Josephus. The major portion in Josephus, this is in his Antiquities of the Jews, is this thing that scholars call the Testimonium Flavianum. So Josephus takes the name Flavius from the Roman imperial household, his Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. And he writes the Antiquities under Roman patronage. And basically what he's doing is saying, hey, Romans, these Jews, they're fabulous people. Okay, so he's an apologist. And in this Flavian testimony, he talks about this fellow named Jesus that was known for doing miracles, that had popular appeal. And then he says, and he was the Messiah, which is weird because Antiquities is over 20 books long. Plus he's got the War of the Jews, which came before that. And plus he wrote his own autobiography. And never, ever, anywhere elsewhere does he ever mention that Jesus is the Messiah. Plus, the works of Josephus that we have were not preserved by the Jews. They were preserved by the Christian church. The Arabic version of Josephus, by the way, does not have the Testimonium Flavianum. So did Josephus make these comments about Jesus? It seems to me likely that he'd said something about Jesus because Jesus was known by Rome. Why? Because of Nero's fire in which he blamed the followers of Jesus. And plus there were Christians in Rome, followers of Jesus in Rome. So Josephus is saying, yeah, these people were following this Jesus guy. And that was it. And then the Christian author, copying Josephus, throws in, oh yeah, he was also the Messiah. That makes sense to me. More credible to me is Josephus's comments on the death of James, the brother of Jesus, happening during an interregnum when one high priest goes out, another one is coming in, and they're in between Roman governors. So there's basically nobody minding the store. And this high priest decides to kill James and a couple of other people, at which point Paul says, leading men among us, which may well have been Pharisees. Paul don't particularly like Pharisees, so if he's going to say something nice about them, he might not say the Pharisees, but I think he means Pharisees, protested this as a gross miscarriage of justice. So what does it tell us? It tells us that Jesus had a brother named James, who was leading this Messianic group in Jerusalem, who got put to death by a high priest. Makes perfect sense to me. So if I see a text and my historical antennae don't go up, and that sounds a little weird, but I think that sounds, that probably made sense. It probably made sense. And Josephus is not getting any particular purchase on this, ragging on some interim high priest. Josephus is a priest. He generally wants to make the priesthood look good. So I think this probably happened. And it seems to fit with more or less what Luke tells us in the book of Acts, where James is running the Jerusalem church in the aftermath of Jesus' death. And it comports also with what Paul tells us in Galatians, where there are men from James who come up to Galatia to unsettle the church. And Paul says he went to Jerusalem and he met with James and Peter and John. So all that seems to fit. It doesn't tell us very much about Jesus, but it does tell us about James. In terms of other external sources regarding Jesus, we don't have much. And what we have is all secondhand or thirdhand. I mean, Josephus did not know Jesus directly. Josephus is getting this stuff about Jesus from Jesus' followers. And then we have to wonder about who were the followers from which he heard this material? Where did they get their stuff? What are they reading? And now we have this problem of this. How do we reconstruct the history so that Josephus got what he got? Even less helpful are Talmudic comments about Jesus, which are a couple of centuries later, in which the rabbis say, oh yeah, there was this fellow named Jesus. We killed him, but we followed exact legal proceedings. So nothing went wrong, and he actually did deserve to die. Which is, they could either say we didn't do it, or they could say we did it, but it was all entirely legal, and none of it has anything to do with history, because the rabbis aren't reflecting history. They're reflecting a couple of centuries later what Christians are saying about them, particularly if these rabbinic comments come after Constantine, when the Roman Empire, now having gone Christian, is making things increasingly difficult for Jews.
And then the final part to that question, what do you make of the reference by Suetonius that at the instigation of Chrestus, that there was some kind of rebellion at Rome that caused the expulsion of the Jews around 49 CE? I know that some claim that some scholars think that there might be a link between that and Christ and Christians, and others say no, there is no link. What are your thoughts on that?
That strikes me as possible. So we don't know who this Crestus is. Crestus, like the toothpaste, right? Crest. This could be concerns about the Christ, and Suetonius has no clue what's going on here. But he talks about the expulsion of the Jews under Claudius in 49, and then when Claudius dies in 54, they go back. Now, when we go to the New Testament, we find out that Paul has these friends named Priscilla and Aquila, who, according to the book of Acts, left Rome because of the edict of Claudius. So we put what Acts tells us together with what Suetonius tells us, and it looks like we've got some sort of confirmation there. Could proclamations of Jesus in Rome have created some difficulty with the local Jewish community? Absolutely. Because, as I noted before, these followers of Jesus, Jewish followers of Jesus, are telling pagans to stop worshiping pagan gods. And that's not going to be good for the local Jewish community, because that's where the message seems to be coming from. So as long as Jews mind their own business, worship their own God, and don't tell the pagans what to do, everything is fine. But as soon as this Messianic group of Jews begins to tell pagans, you can't do what you've been doing your whole lives, and your entire religious system is wrong, and you have to forsake it. And by the way, you probably don't want to eat at mommy and daddy's table anymore, because they may be eating meat offered to idols, and that could be a problem. The local synagogue is going to come into a fair amount of distress by local Gentiles who are not happy with these proclamations. So it would not surprise me that there was some attempt by the broader Jewish community to shut these people up. I think that's also why Paul talks about being disciplined by the synagogue. Paul never leaves his Jewish identity. If he wanted to, he could have voted with his feet and just walked out. But no, he remains part of this group, and therefore he submits himself to synagogue discipline. But he's going to hold the course. So could the Jews have been kicked out because of this Christ thing? Sure. Could this Christus have been somebody else for whom we have no additional historical information? Also possible.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor LaVine.
Thank you for your really good questions. And then if your listeners want to know anything more about me, they can always track me down on email or read the books. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I find Jesus fascinating, and I am convinced that one does not need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good, and I wish that more Christians could find that way around as well.
Agreed. Thank you again.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.